Glad that I get to present right after Ralph Gilmore. Then you guys you're ready for me to talk fast, which is what I intend to do in this lesson. So much that we could go into on this topic. We're really just going to get to do a brief survey of this idea of how do I know God exists? Can we know? How can we know God exists? Not just feel it, not just blindly believe this idea. Does it require a blind faith? Merely just accepting God's existence without enough evidence or any evidence. On one of my geologic field trip that I did a few years ago, we had a denominational gentleman along with us who presented a devotional in which he said that faith has nothing to do with evidence. It's not based on evidence because then evidence would be more important than faith, he said. And much of the denominational world subscribes to this idea known as fideism, reliance on faith rather than reason in pursuit of religious truth. And so this idea has gone to seed. When people hear the word faith, they associate it with this concept, leading to rational people rejecting God. Hollywood, taking the cue from the denominational world, has further promoted the idea of Christianity and religion as being reliant on a blind faith. I remember as a kid seeing Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where they're trying to locate the cup that Jesus used. Remember when he institutes the Lord's Supper, the cup that they believe would give eternal life to whoever drank from it. And a pivotal point in the movie was when the archaeologist, Dr. Jones, has to put aside his reasoning and just close his eyes and step off of the cliff in faith in order to find the cup. Or the statement that millions of Americans hear every December when the 1947 movie Miracle on 34th Street is shown. Faith is believing when common sense tells you not to. And so that sort of thinking gives Christianity, creation, a bad name, and it causes naturalists to just scoff at the Bible and Christianity. But Christianity is first and foremost a religion based on facts. Its true followers really believe in John 8:32. One can know the truth. One doesn't just have to blindly accept the Bible and God without evidence or just rely on vague inner feelings or goosebumps. And that's why Isaiah said, "Come now and let us reason together." Reasoning is a logical term that involves taking available facts, evidence, and using them to draw conclusions. In Acts 26:25, Paul said, "I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason." Acts is loaded with examples of how the apostles and disciples reasoned with people, convincing them of the truth based on the facts. Never do you see them pressuring others to merely blindly accept Jesus without evidence. To do so would be irrational. The law of rationality and philosophy says one should only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. And the Bible concurs with this principle. For example, the Bible words it this way: test all things, hold fast what is good. The New American Standard has examine everything carefully, hold fast what is good. So test things, don't just blindly accept them, and only accept those things that are proven to be true. Do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God. Why? Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Don't just blindly believe what you're told, because there's a lot of false ideas out there. Test the individuals through examination of the evidence. What made the Bereans more fair-minded than the Thessalonians? Well, they didn't just blindly believe what they were being told, even though the preachers were Paul and Silas. Instead, they looked for sufficient evidence before coming to accept what they were being taught. Jesus even told his audience not to believe him if he didn't substantiate his claims with sufficient evidence, miracles in his case. So blind faith isn't a biblical idea. God expects a person to come to know the truth based on the powerful evidence in support of it. Someone says, well, what about doubting Thomas in John chapter 20? Thomas wouldn't believe that Jesus was resurrected without seeing him and touching him, and Jesus rebuked him for not believing without seeing. Isn't this an example of the Bible endorsing a blind faith? That, of course, isn't what's going on in that passage. Thomas had already seen a substantial amount of evidence proving what Jesus taught to be true, including the truth of Jesus' resurrection. The apostles had seen more miracles than perhaps anybody in history. He should have already believed that Jesus would return. He shouldn't have needed to see and touch Jesus. Those who would be able to believe based on other forms of evidence without seeing or touching Jesus would be blessed, happy. And Thomas's evidence-based faith wasn't where it needed to be. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, or the foundation of things hoped for, the starting point. You can't hope for something without first believing it'll happen. And faith is the evidence of things not seen. The underlying Greek indicates that means that faith is to be sure, based upon proof about things unseen. Evidence can't be removed from the biblical faith equation. The biblical portrait of faith is more like the kind of trust that you have in anybody today. Why do I believe my spouse? Is it a blind faith? No, it is based on a substantial amount of evidence that indicates she is trustworthy. She can be trusted. It's not a blind faith to accept that, and that is the faith that God expects us to have in Him, evidence-based faith. Now, it's true that the nature of the evidence for God is indirect rather than direct. You can't see, taste, touch, smell, or hear Him directly. You can't engage in empirical science in studying God directly, but that doesn't mean that our faith is blind. It's like the faith or the work of forensic scientists. They come in after an event, a crime, for instance, and examine the evidence, and they're able to come to reasonable conclusions about what happened without actually ever having witnessed the event, using various forms of reasoning. So when atheists argue that Christians have a blind faith in God because we can't witness God's existence, they're shooting themselves in the foot, because so much of what they themselves must believe isn't based on direct evidence. They haven't seen a Big Bang. They haven't seen life coming from non-life. They haven't seen molecules evolving into humans over billions of years, or laws of science bursting into existence out of nothing, and yet they have to believe in those things anyway. Do they actually have a blind faith? Well, ironically, yes, in their case, because they have to believe in those things without sufficient evidence for them. They must draw conclusions not warranted by the available evidence, making them irrational and holding to a blind faith. But faith in God isn't like that, because we have sufficient evidence that substantiates His existence. Well, evidence like what? Well, in studying the created order over the centuries, humans have reasoned from the evidence and articulated many excellent philosophical arguments that point to the conclusion that there must be a God, arguments which, fight though the atheists might, continue to stand today as testaments to God's existence after hundreds of years. And you've heard about so many of these. The ontological argument, the fact that we can't conceive of characteristics that we don't know exist, and yet we can conceive of superlative characteristics like omniscience, indicating they must exist in some being. The moral argument, so the fact that there really is such a thing as just and unjust things, fairness and unfairness, objective right and wrong, not subject to man's opinion, implying a higher moral lawgiver. We know that the Nazis in World War II were guilty of heinous crimes against Jews and Christians and others. Or was that really, heinous what they were doing? Or was that just the opinion of the Allied powers that they were doing heinous things, which is what the Nazis argued? Was it really morally wrong when 6 out of 9 million of the Jews who lived in Europe were exterminated by gas, starvation, experimentation, and other terrible methods? Why couldn't the Nazis do whatever they wanted? If they're the strong, why couldn't they eliminate the weak in the name of evolution? Should we apologize to them for that? What about Jeffrey Dahmer? He murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys, engaged in sexual activity with his dead victims, even ate some of them, experimented on them while they were alive, injecting things into their brain, kept the skulls as trophies. Was he really wrong to do that, or was that just American opinion? In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis discusses the concept of the conscience, the sense of oughtness that we all have. If we were standing along a roaring river's edge and a man drowning passed in front of us, our first instinct would likely be to save that person, and we would then have a second instinct, the instinct to stop and consider our own safety. And the third instinct is the conscience. It's the part of our soul telling us what we ought to do, regardless of ourselves. Now, we might dampen that sense of oughtness and sear it over time by ignoring it, but the instinct was there from our beginning. Animals don't have this instinct, but humans clearly do. And it's not a physical genetic thing, so it can't be explained by purely atheistic or naturalistic evolution. Why would all humans have this sense of moral oughtness, which is a spiritual quality, not a physical one? This is evidence that humans were created by a moral being that created moral creatures. Real morality exists. It doesn't matter what culture or setting a person grows up in. We understand from a young age, even if we haven't even been taught about it, that there is right and wrong. We know that it isn't right, it isn't fair, is the terminology we'll use as children, if another person comes and takes something from me that's not his, that he hasn't been given or worked for in the first place. We don't even have to learn that. We already know that's not fair. That's not fair, we think. So we know, even if we're 3 years old, that if we steal a cookie and our brother steals a cookie too, but I get in trouble and he doesn't, we know that's not right. It's not just. It's not fair. And so we all understand it's not fair. If we work for our whole lives for something and someone comes and beats us up and takes it, that's not right, even if it's the government doing it, right? So mankind gets this idea. We understand if we do a whole bunch of work writing a paper, someone comes and takes that paper and says it's their own, plagiarizes it, that's not right. Now, we may accept these things and say, oh, well, it's just the way of the world, and move on. But the point is, we all know it is unfair. It's not right. And it's not just an opinion to say that. We all know this. Injustice is therefore objectively wrong. We understand this, that there's a higher law that governs everyone about fairness and justice that is above humans and not subject to our opinions. But there can't be this higher law code that is above the opinions of humanity without there being a moral lawmaker that wrote that law code. So objective morality illustrates there must be a God, and that is the moral argument. Now, concerning the fact that we intuitively understand this idea of fairness and justice, that we seem to have been built with a program that governs human behavior, it's interesting to note the fact that in the Bible, the English words translated righteous or just are translated interchangeably from their underlying Greek and Hebrew words. In Hebrew, tzaddik can be translated as either righteous or just. In Greek, dikaios can be translated as righteous or just. The implication seems to be that what is right and wrong comes down to what is fair, what is just. The fact that we've been programmed with this fairness meter means that we have a program that can be used to determine right and wrong in many cases, which means that there is right and wrong, that humans don't just make this up. It's programmed into us, not developed by us. And so the minute a person admits that there are things that are objectively unfair for everyone, he's admitting to the existence of objective moral value, a higher set of standards which could have only been instituted by a higher being. And in so doing, he's rejecting atheism. Now, tied to the moral argument is the intuitional argument. Humans are incurably religious. Our intuition tells us that there is a God. It seems to be common sense to humanity, as though, again, we've been programmed to believe. According to adherence.com, some 92% of the world believes there is something beyond the purely physical. 86% of the world is involved in worshiping something. This isn't something the animals do. This is something humans do, though, and atheism can't explain this apparent tendency to be religious. Michael Shermer is a famous skeptic. He said, "We perceive nature to be intelligently designed." He says, since the most common reason people give for why they believe in God is the good design in the world, intelligent design creationists are tapping into the, notice, intuitive understanding most people hold about life and the universe. Famous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins said, "It's almost as if the human brain were specifically designed to find Darwinism hard to believe." He says, "Why, if it is false, does every culture in the world have religion? True or false, religion is ubiquitous, so where does it come from?" Psychologists Paul Bloom and Dina Weisberg of Yale University, University of Pennsylvania, respectively, acknowledge there is by now a large body of research suggesting that humans are, notice, natural-born creationists. When we see non-random structure and design, we assume that it was created by an intelligent being. Geneticist Dean Hamer even wrote a book called The God Gene, where he acknowledged humans seem to be hardwired to be religious, and he was trying to determine, how do you explain this from an atheistic perspective? Are there actual genes involved, right? There can't be anything beyond the purely physical if you're an atheist. So he's got to come up with some physical way to explain this religiosity that we have. And of course, no such gene has ever been found, and so this religious inclination of humanity is an acknowledged problem for atheists. Why? Why is this a problem? Well, Dawkins says religion is so wasteful, it's so extravagant, and Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. So why would religion be so ubiquitous? Famous atheistic philosopher Daniel Dennett expounds on the problem of how religion is costly. He says, "The world is populated by billions of people, almost all of whom devote a significant fraction of their time and energy to some sort of religious activity, rituals such as daily prayer, both public and private, or frequent attendance at ceremonies, but also costly sacrifices, not working on certain days, no matter what looming crisis needs prompt attention, and abiding by a host of strenuously observed prohibitions and requirements." So if evolution were true, why wasn't religion eliminated? But humans engage in this costly endeavor that should have worked against us from an evolutionary perspective and ultimately caused the demise of humans, but it's done the opposite. It doesn't fit atheistic predictions if atheism is true. So evolutionists are going to great lengths to try to explain human religiosity in some kind of purely physical way without acknowledging the existence of a spiritual realm, but their arguments cut both ways and ultimately require a blind faith. There's no evidence that religion can be explained genetically, and keep in mind, we've already sequenced the genome and we know what's there. And bottom line, humanity seems to have been built to be religious, and it's a spiritual thing. It makes no sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our natural inclination to believe that there's something beyond us, above us, that we're beholden to and should worship is evidence of this super being existing that put this instinct in us, which seems to be being alluded to in Acts 17. He's made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, so that they should seek the Lord. He made humans in a way that they would seek him in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. God made us with this desire to seek him, to grope for him. Human intuition indicates there must be a God. Another classical argument for the existence of God, what's called the teleological argument or the design argument. Atheistic philosopher and professor Paul Ricci said, "It's true, everything designed has a designer." And that statement summarizes the implications of the teleological argument. If you find that there is design in the universe, there had to be, by implication, a universe designer. Now, usually atheists like Ricci admit that basic truth, but sometimes they don't. There's weird examples where they say, no, design doesn't imply a designer, but that's irrational. But they usually will acknowledge this. Now, granted, they generally refuse to admit the existence of design in the universe, but they concede that if you could find design, there must be a designer, because you can't have a poem without there being a poet. A painting requires a painter. A fingerprint requires a finger, right? So does the universe contain the characteristic of design? In fact, there's an infinite number of examples that rationally demand that there has to be a designer. Things that show intention, purpose, design. There's so many examples of design in the universe, and notice what Shermer said about this. The design inference comes naturally. The reason people think that a designer created the world is because it looks designed. Right? This is a skeptic saying this. We perceive nature to be intelligently designed, he says, based on our experience of human artifacts. In other words, we're just not coming up with this blindly and irrationally. We got a lot of evidence that forces us to reason through this. We know some human artifacts are intelligently designed because we've observed them being made and we have vast experience with human artificers. So it's logical for us to realize there must be a designer. You've got to be illogical to not come to that conclusion. Notice this statement from Shermer again, since the most common reason people give for why they believe in God is the good design of the world, intelligent design creationists are tapping into the intuitive understanding most people hold about life and the universe. Notice again, this is intuitive for people to acknowledge there's design in the universe. Now, I've done a lot of work in various areas of science, and so let's look at just an example in the area of biothermal science. One of the amazing thermal systems that the Creator put into place in the human is what we call the biothermal system. This is the system that oversees how your body responds to temperature. Temperature changes in the environment, temperature changes in your body, and your body does this through its use of this extremely complex thermoregulatory system. This is the system that helps to regulate your temperature in your body. And so I could do an entire session just on this. Let's just look at a couple quick things. The entire temperature system for your body, as you might expect, is controlled by the brain. And the processing center in the brain that controls the biothermal system is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is basically the thermostat for the body's air conditioning system, so it's controlling the thermoregulatory system. And the body uses temperature sensors like thermometers or thermocouples in engineering that are called thermoreceptors, and these sensors are located strategically throughout your body in important places where they're reading temperature wherever they are. And so they're in your hypothalamus in your brain, they're in your skin, they're in your bladder, they're even in your eyes. And the thermoreceptor that are in the skin are the peripheral nerves, and they're detecting change in external temperature, so temperature change in the air. And the thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus are actually monitoring your blood temperature, and all this information is acquired and sent to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is able to adjust your body's thermoregulatory function using effector nerves. These are kind of like power lines that are used to communicate with various parts of the body to initiate various kinds of response to temperature. It's a very sophisticated system that shows intention, planning, forethought, not random accents. So let's just look at an example of how this plays out. One small, often neglected, but amazing part of this temperature system is in your bladder, on your bladder. It's the detrusor muscle. And there are thermoreceptors in your bladder, and they're taking the temperature of the liquid therein, and it sends that temperature information up to the hypothalamus using these power lines of communication in the nervous system, the effector nerves. And as the temperature of the bladder drops due to getting colder, a bladder cooling reflex is triggered in the hypothalamus, and the message is sent to the detrusor muscle on the bladder, urging it to contract. And that detrusor contraction makes you feel the urge to go eliminate that cooler liquid from your body, therefore keeping your body's core temperature regulated. All right, now wait, step back here and think. Let's not have a blind faith about this. Could that just happen by accident? Okay, who has the blind faith here? How could someone even have the knowledge to come up with this sophisticated system where you got the muscle and the sensors and the nerves connecting the bladder all the way to the hypothalamus? They all have to be planned out and intact, working from the very beginning. How helpful would an effector nerve be that only went halfway between the brain and the bladder? This had to already be planned out and installed by an engineer. This shows logically design. Words like planning, intention, forethought. When you look at this without bias, it's common sense, it's logical, which is what Shermer's getting at with his quotes. There's no way around this. The natural order and its complexity are stunning, and I'm not alone in recognizing that. One area of engineering that has grown by leaps and bounds over the last couple decades is called biomimicry, as well as bio-inspired engineering. And biomimicry is where engineers use nature as a blueprint and try to copy it. The webpage for George Washington University's Center for Biomimetics and Bio-Inspired Engineering, notice what they say. However, despite our seeming prowess in these component technologies, we find it hard to outperform nature in this arena. Nature's solutions are smarter, more energy efficient, agile, adaptable, fault-tolerant, environmentally friendly, and multifunctional. Thus, there's much that we as engineers can learn from nature as we develop the next generation machines and technologies. In other words, nature is well engineered. So much so that the top engineering minds have given up on trying to figure out how to do these things on our own. We're looking to nature to get ideas for our design. And many of these engineers would hardly be considered friendly to the Christian thinking. And so this is what we might call hostile testimony from the scientific community. This is testimony from the enemies of creationists who can't help but concede our point about this. And this kind of mindset is becoming widespread in the engineering community. Engineers stand in awe of the designs that we're seeing in nature. And so here's just a single example of that. Engineers are more and more coming to the realization that insects function amazingly well when you consider that their brains can carry less than 0.01% as many neurons as do the human brains. And yet their ability to maneuver, especially in the air, the acrobatics that they can do and so forth, is unequaled in engineering. We cannot match what these creatures can do. And one of the insect features that engineers discovered recently, relatively recently, is that insects are equipped with a sophisticated engineering sensor that helps the insect keep track of its orientation and stay upright while it's doing these acrobatics in the air. Ocelli are small eyes located on the heads of various kinds of insects. These are in addition to the larger compound eyes that you can see more easily and therefore you usually think of as an insect's eyes. Compound eyes are associated with vision, but many of these flying insects have ocelli in addition to their compound eyes, and engineers believe that these ocelli are horizon sensors dedicated to that purpose. They locate the horizon to help the insect keep track of its orientation, and so with these ocelli in mind, engineers have started to mimic these horizon sensors in the design of aerial vehicles. And so Caltech and Australian National University, along with NASA, started developing a biomorphic ocellus mimicking the ocelli of dragonflies in order to help achieve an improved flight stabilization system for aerial vehicles. So when engineers engage in this kind of design, they're acknowledging tacitly the awesomeness of the natural realm and the presence of design in the universe, whether or not they intend to. It's not enough to say, well, evolution somehow just caused these features, but we can't really do that. We got to go design this. That doesn't make sense. There's implications to what is going on here. Many, many other powerful evidences of design we could look at. This gives you a quick taste. How can we know that God exists? Does it require a blind faith? No, quite the opposite. It would require a blind faith not to believe in God. Now, connected to the teleological argument, further evidence of design would be what we call the aesthetic argument. The fact that beauty exists, and we've been given the capability of appreciating this. Atheism can't adequately explain beauty because that appreciation for beauty, by and large, has no evolutionary advantage. And this highlights the fact that a God must exist who is benevolent, who cares about his creation and wants to give us joy and pleasure. Now, Darwin recognized this argument as a threat to evolutionary theory. In The Origin of Species, he said, some authors believe that many structures have been created for the sake of beauty, to delight man or the creator, or for the sake of mere variety. Such doctrines, if true, would be absolutely fatal to my theory. Why? Well, because evolution can't explain how something would become beautiful for the sole benefit of others. Because evolution is the survival of the fittest. It's the selfish battle of the strong for survival. It's not about others. It's totally a selfish thing. And so evolving a trait has to have a selfish benefit, not the benefit of others. And so he argued, well, okay, beauty wasn't created. It evolved accidentally, and then it tends to stick around, for example, in beautiful male creatures that you see like in the beautiful male birds, because that beauty benefits those creatures personally in getting mates, sexual selection, while the ugly animals don't get those mates and die out. See any problems with that argument? Do you see a lot of ugly animals out there, first of all? And number two, it tends to be the males going after the females, not the females going after the males. Why would the males have the beauty? But there's other problems. Darwin's natural selection only helps explain the survival of the fittest. He didn't have a way to explain the arrival of the fittest in the first way. He had no way to get the new creature, only the way to explain how a particular creature stuck around. It's a filtering mechanism. So where do you get beauty in the first place? There's no known evolutionary mechanism for the generation of new genetic information. Mutations have been shown to not be able to provide that, and yet you need new genetic information to create beauty where there once was no beauty. But also notice that natural selection doesn't explain why you have this innate appreciation of beauty in the first place. Why you get joy and pleasure and happiness merely from hearing beautiful music from an orchestra or seeing a waterfall or a sunset. And in fact, a lot of times you get these good feelings by doing things that are going to be harmful to you. Right? How does evolution explain this? Well, natural selection might explain why something beautiful tends to stick around. It doesn't explain why you perceive that thing as beautiful in the first place. Why do you have an appreciation for beauty? And therein lies the argument for the existence of a loving God. He's made everything beautiful in its time, Ecclesiastes 3:11, things that are pleasant for the eyes, Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 7. And there's one of my favorites, the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The cosmos, the universe, is here. It had to come from somewhere. Remember in Job 38, God lays out the thrust of this argument. He asks Job about the creation of the earth and the universe. Where did it come from? Who created it? Who laid the foundation of the earth? Who determined its measurements? Who stretched the line upon it? Who laid its cornerstone? The universe exists and it demands a cause. There has to be a reason, a cause for the universe. Now, cause and effect is fundamental to science. This is what science is all about. You're trying to determine the effects of various causes and the causes of various effects. Now, if we want to be rational, we have to accept the evidence, and the evidence says that the law of cause and effect, or the law of causality, governs the entire universe. We don't see an example of where that is not happening. Sometimes we can't exactly figure out what's going on with the cause, like in quantum mechanics, but that does not mean that we're saying there's not an ultimate cause. And so paraphrasing, it basically says if you've got an effect, there must logically be a cause. More precisely, every material effect that we've ever witnessed, every physical effect in the universe must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. So the cause has to precede or come before the effect, or it can occur at the same time as the effect, and it has to have the necessary potential. It has to be adequate enough to cause the effect. All natural effects must have causes. We know that in nature, an effect has a cause. The fact that the planets exist, that they're floating through space and spinning, shows that they are an effect. The existence of life, living things, that's an effect, and therefore there must be an adequate cause. Someone has to cause these things to happen, and yet the naturalist has no explanation for this. The mere existence of the cosmos is proof of the existence of a supernatural being that created it. All right, so how does the naturalist deal with this conundrum? What cause can the atheist point to try to explain the existence of the universe without a supernatural being? Generally today, atheists argue that the origin of the universe can be explained from a massive explosion-type event of this hot, tiny, dense speck billions of years ago. Then they call this the Big Bang explosion. But even if that were true, of course, we ask the question, where did that little speck come from? Now, if you're a naturalist, if you don't accept anything supernatural, things only occur based on the laws of nature, then you really only have two options. Either it created itself, so matter and energy spontaneously generated, or it is eternal, it is self-existent. The universe has always been here. So let's look at the first option and consider the evidence. Let's say that there is an invisible box around the universe, a boundary layer that is big enough to hold the entire universe in it. So if you believe that the universe could spontaneously generate, just pop into existence on its own from nothing, keeping in mind this is the dominant belief of most evolutionary cosmologists today, most of the cosmological community. In a thermodynamic sense, you believe that the box was initially completely empty, all right? And so let's zoom inside of the box here. And so the box is empty and we're inside of it. The spontaneous generation model says no one put the stuff of the universe here. It put itself here. And so according to this model, you can stand around inside of this box and stare into nothingness. And if you give it enough time, all of a sudden, ta-da, Something can appear. And not only could something just pop into existence, but according to this version of the model, a little speck containing all of the mass and energy of the entire universe could just pop into existence. And then, so they say, the Big Bang process started. Eventually, given enough time, the universe expands. By the way, expands faster than the speed of light initially. Nobody knows how that could happen. Nobody knows what would start it. Nobody knows what would stop it, and there's no evidence for it. But they must blindly believe in that happening in order to try to fix the horizon and flatness problems that come with the Big Bang. We could talk about this a whole session. We don't have time. But anyway, over time, finally, eventually, life somehow comes into existence. They don't know how that could happen either. And it somehow evolves. They don't know how that could happen either. And eventually, you accidentally show up in the universe. This is the dominant belief system. It's basically a modern, respectable form of superstitious witchcraft. It's really what we're looking at. It's witchcraft without a witch. There's major problems with this, and the first one comes in the form of the first law of thermodynamics. Keep in mind, there's lots of laws of physics out there, but there are some that we call super laws, meaning that they are so fundamental to everything that other laws are developed based on these laws. Okay, and the laws of thermodynamics are two of those, at least the first and second laws. First law of thermodynamics is summarized, for example, by this evolutionist. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can only be converted from one form to another. And we call this first law of thermodynamics, or the law of conservation of matter and energy. All right, so what does this mean, practically speaking? Well, have you ever thought about what happened to a piece of wood when you burned it? Where did it all go? All you've got is this pile of ash. That doesn't account for all of it. So did some of it disappear from the universe? In other words, was it destroyed? The first law says that in any process we've ever witnessed in the universe, matter and energy can change into other forms while it's going through its process. Heat, light, ash, chemicals. But the sum total amount of energy that was present before that process, in this case, before you burn the wood, has to be the same amount that is present after you burn. So energy hasn't appeared or been destroyed from the universe by whatever process we're looking at. So using more technical terminology, the first law says that in any system, and specifically in our case, we're looking at a closed system because we have our box that contains the entire universe. So if you're a naturalist, you can't believe that there's anything outside of that box. All that exists is what we've observed to exist in nature. So in a closed system, there's no energy coming in. If you've got no energy coming into that box or leaving the box, that's what makes it a closed system. The sum total amount of energy within the boundaries of that system will remain constant. And so as this chart shows, the amount of energy present before any process, a process like wood burning, the amount of energy present before a process has to equal the amount of energy after the process. If you don't start with anything in the box before a process, then guess what you're going to have after a process? Really, there's not going to be a process, right? It's just nothing's going to exist. This is real complicated, right? Nothing pops into existence. It's not going to happen. According to the first law of thermodynamics, which has no exceptions, or it would not be a scientific law. And so by implication, it would be unscientific, it would go against the laws of science, to believe that matter and energy could come into being in such a way that the first law of thermodynamics was violated. You would now be arguing for something not natural. You're no longer a naturalist. You're a supernaturalist, which is a big point that I try to make to these atheistic guys. There's really no such thing as a pure naturalist. Everybody has to believe things have happened that don't happen naturally at some point. They have to believe life can come from non-life. That goes against nature to argue that. This is what we learn from science. No wonder British evolutionary biologist and atheist of Oxford University, Richard Dawkins, in a television interview in 2012, notice what he said.
Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe.
All right, now think through that. Notice what he's admitting here. What he's saying is, in order to believe that naturalism could somehow explain the universe, that's counterintuitive. Based on all the evidence, it goes against your common sense. So how does he respond to that? Well, that's just interesting. It's mysterious. How about you change the word mysterious and put supernatural there? Because that's really what he's saying. It's counterintuitive. It goes against your common sense because it goes against all the available evidence we have. In other words, to believe that can happen, you have to have a blind faith. Not creationists, not Christians. We don't have to have a blind faith. They're the ones that have to have this. They're the ones shoving it down our young people's throat to great effect, right? I mean, naturalism, we're up to about 25% of Americans now due to this kind of business being taught. So according to the scientific evidence, the first option is not possible if you stick with the actual evidence, and yet that's the dominant belief around us. Well, for the sake of being thorough, what about the second option? Could matter and energy, could the universe have always existed? This was an idea that people used to believe decades ago, but finally recognized, okay, there's major problems with that idea, and so they backed away from it. This model claims the universe has always been inside of our box. Nobody had to put it there. It didn't have to create itself because it's always been there, either moving through space forever, expanding, or if you believe in the oscillating universe model, you believe the universe operates in a cycle where you have a collapse and then a big bang and another expansion and then a collapse, another big bang, expansion, and so forth, repeating forever. Either way, this model says that matter and energy are eternal. The universe has always been here throughout billions and billions, an infinite amount of time. All right, now, recall the well-known atheist philosopher, physicist, cosmologist, and astrobiologist Paul Davies at Arizona State University. Writing in New Scientist, he explained the second law of thermodynamics this way. The celebrated second law of thermodynamics says, roughly speaking, that in any change, the universe becomes a slightly more disorderly place. The entropy goes up, the information content goes down. This natural tendency towards disintegration and chaos, notice he says, is evident all around us. All right, so in a technical sense, the second law of thermodynamics builds on the first law and says that although the same amount of energy is present after a process, according to the first law, some of that energy transforms into less usable energy in any process we've ever seen in the universe. And we call this entropy. And it's an irreversible process. It only goes in one direction. It doesn't go the other direction, which is, by the way, another thing that bothers them. Why is that? Why are there laws? They can't get their mind around the most basic of questions. Science tries to explain what the laws are doing, but they can't explain why they do it. All right, the Bible weighs in on that. But they can't explain. They have no explanation for this, and they just push that aside like that's not a big deal here. As though that doesn't answer this whole question immediately. Why does the universe behave in a way? Nobody knows. It's somehow being forced to do that, and there's no physical mechanism to explain it. You know, why does gravity do what it does? Nobody knows. Nobody has an explanation for this. You need some kind of, I don't know, omniscient, omnipotent being to do that, to force the universe to do that. Now, what this means, practically speaking, is everything's wearing out. That's what the second law basically implies. The universe is running down, and as Paul Davies said, you can see this idea everywhere. Wouldn't it be nice if a car got nicer over time? You go to a junkyard, and you see a Ferrari sitting there, and you just sit there and wait, and eventually it's going to get nicer, okay? Wouldn't that be nice? It doesn't happen, though. Wouldn't it be nice if our kids' rooms just magically cleaned themselves and got better over time? They didn't tend towards chaos and disorder. But as Paul Davies says, we see this idea everywhere. Things are corrupting. Returning to our wood-burning example, when wood burns, all that energy that was present before it burned is still there according to the first law. But according to the second law of thermodynamics, much of it is transformed into less usable forms like heat. And after that heat dissipates, you're essentially left with a pile of ash, which of course isn't nearly as usable. Now, just like with the first law, the second law has never been broken. It's another one of these super laws. It doesn't have exceptions. One thermodynamics textbook put it this way: to date, no experiment has been conducted that contradicts the second law, and this should be taken as sufficient proof of its validity. If you're being rational, all the evidence indicates there's no exceptions to this. All right, so what does that mean concerning the origins question? What's the implication? Well, it means that the universe could not have always existed if we still have usable energy. Right? According to the second law of thermodynamics, if the universe is infinite in age, we should be totally out of usable energy. In other words, we should be totally broken down to a state of heat death, is what we call that, in the universe. And yet we have an abundant amount of usable energy in harmony with the creation model, which says that the universe is actually relatively young. Notice that the biblical model is in harmony with these laws of thermodynamics. So, for example, the creation model would predict the universe is going to be growing old, it's decaying, just like the second law indicates. The universe is not going to last forever. Notice, for example, Psalm 102, keeping in mind this was written thousands of years ago before we articulated the second law in the 1800s. All right, Psalm 102, of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak. You'll change them, and they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. In other words, God is not subject to the second law of thermodynamics, right? There's no end to his power. The universe, though, it's a physical thing. It's not going to last forever. So again, according to the laws of science, specifically the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which have no exceptions, the spontaneous generation of the stuff of the universe could not have occurred, and matter cannot be eternal. And those are the only two options if naturalism were true. And so natural evolution, atheism, is not true. It can't be if you're basing this on the evidence and not having a blind faith. So by process of elimination, that leaves some form of creation. And on top of that, the biblical creation model is actually supported by both the first and second laws. Both of these are hinted at in multiple places in your Bible. So if you stick with the evidence rather than blindly accepting what naturalists have been shoving down our throats for decades, the evidence demands that there has to be a supernatural being out there. And that is the cosmological argument. The universe is here. It couldn't create itself. Requires a creator. An omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent being outside the confines of the natural world. Belief in God is not a blind faith. The evidence logically demands the conclusion that he exists. But in a day where naturalism is on the rise quickly, with 25% of Americans now naturalistic and more every day, we all need to be regularly reminded of the reasons for our faith. And we especially need to be communicating those truths to our young people who are on the front lines of this every day. And so we don't merely need to know that God exists. We have to tell others and prepare them to defend the truth. But regardless of what happens to the world around us, of course, we know the truth. And our ultimate destination can be secure as Christians as long as we maintain our obedient faith in him. Thank you for your attention.